I love it.
I'll be at a slight disadvantage tonight because everything that normally works in my studio isn't working. So anyway, so yeah, I just realized that what I normally have pulled up on my computer, I can't. So here we go. Now I've got it. But yeah, so welcome to the Indie Review Show. I'm Cory Kerr.
And I'm Joshua Kemble.
And this is the Indie Review Show.
This is the series where we review the best of indie comics and other media like movies, TV, cartoons, books, and did we mention comics? The idea is that we're pulling back the curtains on our inspirations.
Josh and I have been professional illustrators, cartoonists, animators, graphic designers, and we've both taught at the college level. And we're getting into the stuff that inspires us.
Yeah, so before we get into the stuff that inspires us and the book that we're going to review tonight, why don't we talk about the stuff we've made from those inspirations? So, Cory, what do you have to plug?
Yes, if you guys want to check out CoryKerr.com, that is where I kind of house everything. And I'll show you really fast kind of how I have that organized really quick. Let me see if I can do this with my Mickey Mouse setup I've done here. There we go. It's desaturated, but if you go to CoryKerr.com/online, then I've got kind of a bunch of spots. And so if you want to see anything like my animated short that won a bunch of awards, or a recent thing I did with Aurora Heated Apparel and my screen printing, or my newest episode of Endo Exo, my comic, all that stuff. It is there at CoryKerr.com, and you just click on what's new, or you can see whatever else. And Josh, how about you?
Awesome. So as usual, I have my book, Two Stories, which is a graphic novel that I did about faith and mental illness. It's hand lettered, hand inked, and could be handed to you in print. You can basically get this at a discounted rate right now on Amazon.com, but it's also available on most online retailers. I just guide people to Amazon because it helps the rankings of the books. But if you're into especially the type of book that we're reviewing today, like memoir and indie graphic novels that are really heartfelt and kind of, once again, independent, go check this out and pick up a copy. All right, so tonight I am super intimidated to be talking about this book, which the cover was printed on like a metallic, so it doesn't appear too great on camera. But at the same time, this is Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, a Family Tragicomic. And the reason I'm slightly intimidated to go into this is if I made like a top 10 list of graphic novels to recommend to people, this would easily be on that. It's just like a very profound and impactful and important book. And just like, honestly, it's one of the better books written, but as a graphic novel, it really pushes the medium. So I hope I do it some justice getting into the review of it. All right. So let's get into it. So it's Fun Home. It's a family tragicomic. This thing, when it came out, just kind of rocked the literary world. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for about a year to 2 years, I think, straight. It's Time Magazine's #1 book of the year, National Book Critics Circle Award, and Alison Bechdel actually got the MacArthur Genius Grant for this book. So I'm intentionally overhyping this because it's one of those books that I don't think can be overhyped. The characters in it are I'm just going to go over the characters real quick just because they're going to come in and out. And these are mainly the main characters. I'm not going to mention like the ancillary characters. But the main characters are Alison Bechdel, the author and protagonist, Bruce Bechdel, who's Alison's father, and that's this figure here. This is Alison as a kid. Helen Bechdel, who's Alison's mother. Joan, Alison's first girlfriend. Roy, one of Bruce's English students. And then Alison's brother, Christian, and I believe her other brother's name is Mark. So that's like the main characters. More minor characters are going to appear throughout. So let's see. Let me clock this at an hour too, just to make sure.
And while you're doing that, this is going to show my ignorance, but is this Bechdel of the Bechdel test?
Yes. So she's the inventor of the Bechdel test. She does. I should also give a little heads up. Like, if anyone watching this isn't prepared for like all age material, this would be a good time to kind of shut it off, because this is definitely a heavy book and it's definitely geared towards adult readers, not for like, children. So, because it's got some pretty graphic depictions of sexuality, that some of which I'm going to block out, but and then some frank discussions of heavy topics like suicide and family abuse and all sorts of really heavy topics that frankly, like, be prepared for before you pick up the book. So I wouldn't buy this for like a 10-year-old, but I might for like a 16-year-old. You know what I mean? Okay. Okay, so, but yeah, Bechdel actually created the Bechdel test. She's done a running strip called Dykes to Watch Out for years, which I think the Bechdel test originates from. It was like a bit in her comic where she was talking about how female characters aren't written about enough, and when they are in stories, they usually only service the male protagonist. So the Bechdel test was like these certain questions you can ask about your female characters in your book to see if you're basically being sexist or if you're depicting a woman in a realistic fashion. It's actually really helpful. I recommend people look it up and follow that. Actually, the Bechdel test helped me a lot in my book, Two Stories, because I realized the first iteration of my chapter 2 failed the test hard. And so I decided to redraft it a little bit to give the female characters in it a little bit more depth. Okay, so there's a ton to get through, so I want to get into it. But I definitely would recommend, this book. So okay, so we have Fun Home, and I'm going to just try to zoom through this. The style, you're going to notice, like the art is done in a very illustrative style, and I never say that in the negative way that it's often used. It's just like a very common style that we're used to seeing in like Beverly Cleary or Wind in the Willows, that kind of thing, where it's a very loose line. With washes of blue, like they almost have like a watercolor effect to them, and they're definitely like very cartooned faces, but not like the anatomy is still representational, but it's definitely got like this very simplified way of drawing the cartooning. I don't know if that makes sense, but so that's kind of style. I'm mostly going to talk about story in this, because while the art is impressive and services the story, like the story itself is pretty impressive, and the writing uses a lot of things that I think, as artists and writers, we can draw from. So, okay, let's get into it. Are you ready? Any questions before I kind of get through? All right, cool. All right, so at first we're introduced to Bruce, the father in the story, and the author, and it starts with this. It starts kind of showing a lot of the way the book is going to proceed from moving forward. She compares her father to Icarus while he's flying her, like doing the airplane thing, and also to, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Daedalus, the guy who built the wings and also built like the labyrinth for the Minotaur.
Daedalus?
Yeah, Daedalus. And so she's starting it off initially with like metaphor and comparison, and you're going to see this like mirroring of metaphor and comparison throughout the entire thing. In this case, she's saying, this balancing game was called an Icarian game, but that it actually ironically wasn't her who fell, that her father was Icarus. And so that's kind of our introduction, but that sets the tone that's going to proceed throughout the whole book. So then we find out that this father lives in this insane house, and that basically her father is obsessed with restoring this old Victorian house that they live in, and that he's been gifted, like he basically has a gift with interior decorating and restoration. So he's like obsessed with restoring this old building that they live in. And so this is just basically like him using recycling and stuff and talking about the different ways that he's restored these buildings and stuff. And you also start getting the through dialogue, you start getting the picture that this father character is like, he's pretty strict about and kind of a perfectionist about redecorating the house. So, okay. So now she gets into the history of the Gothic Revival house, where it's basically showing the father restoring it, but then it also talks about, it also intersperses throughout some of the history of this Gothic Revival house in Pennsylvania. So we start getting a little bit of the small town setting that she's living in. And he's doing all this crazy restoration, all the way down to like the gold leafing on the outside of it. But we also get the picture that the father is abusive to his family, due to his perfectionism. And the Daedalus, is it Daedalus?
Yeah.
Cory?
I think
okay. So that comparison continues throughout. We also get the sense that the parents weren't super collaborative. So that kind of comes out throughout. But here it's just, once again, just this kind of overbearing father who's very abusive. Their collaborations are like him asking her what she thinks, and then he comes back with something completely different than what she suggests with his wife. Mm-hmm. So Bechdel starts growing in contempt for all things Victorian, and also for like these crazy, like overly feminine outfits that he dresses them in, because he's also very controlling about how they dress. He wants them to dress in like this old Gothic style, and that she's actually her version of rebellion is like less ornamentation, and because she feels like it reflects her father's ability to lie, and that ornamentation is a lie. So she starts straying towards modernism at a really young age. So we find out
real quick, Gary's saying, going by college Latin, Daedalus.
Okay.
Sounds better than what I was saying.
Thank you. That makes a little more sense. So we find out that despite appearances, that Bruce, so it's once again going into his house restoring and stuff like that, and how he appears to be this great father, and they show him at church, and it turns out that he was sleeping with teenage boys. And so that kind of sets the shocking tone of the whole thing, where you're like, wait, what?
How do they reveal that?
She says, he appeared to be an ideal husband and father, for example, but would an ideal husband and father have sex with teenage boys?
Mm.
And then, so she's kind of thinking back on this figure. But okay, so also we find out that like if her family, like if her father, if they ever even mention his appearance, he gets physically abusive, and that the father was basically a self-loathing person who couldn't like handle, like he had some sort of self-loathing going on, and that kindness was rare for him. So then it's revealed here that basically like through this like, very sad sequence, that it turns out that her father had actually killed himself. And so so now we realize we're looking back on her memories of her father who has committed suicide. So let's see here. Make sure. So then it gets back to this kind of memory of like a fond memory she has of like her father bathing her and her getting really cold and enjoying the fact that it would like, she liked to get really cold and then he'd pour warm water over her. And then him teaching her how to ride the tractor and her kind of missing her father. But it's like a pretty heavy intro, and that's the first chapter. So you obviously are left with quite a few questions. I hope I'm not zooming through this. It's just a heavy book, so I definitely want to make sure we get through a lot of it.
Yeah, it's it's already, there's the story beats are really, for a comic, one of my challenges with comics is that sometimes the story beats are really spread out. Yeah. But they feel very condensed here.
Yeah.
But not in a way that feels rushed.
Yeah. And one of the great things about it is, it is plotted out like a novel. So like another thing I do with my book too is like break it into chapters, because one of my irritations with comics is like when they are doing a long story and there's no chapter breaks, I understand it, but it's just one of those great things from books that I feel like it should be used. And I do love these kind of Edward Gorey-esque, like she does a much more rendered hatching version for like as almost like these little photos as chapter breaks. So we get on to chapter 2, A Happy Death. And so we find out that her father's suicide wasn't certain. So they aren't certain that he killed himself, that he was actually hit by a truck, and that the mother, so this is them at the funeral home, and her kind of struggling with people saying, oh, he was such a good man. Her mother had filed for divorce 2 weeks prior to her dad's death. And we also find out that her dad was like a reader, like a heavy reader, and that's going to tie in with a lot of parallels like throughout the story. But here we find out that he left a copy of Camus' A Happy Death, highlighting a passage. And I love the way she does this. She does this throughout the book, but whenever she quotes books, she actually has like sections of the books, but they're all hand lettered too, which obviously I definitely use that same thing in my own comics, because I feel like if you're gonna have text in a hand lettered book, it should all be hand lettered, even if it's like, even if it's typeset. So
can you hold that up to the camera? I want to see that a little bit closer. Interesting. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, so we find out that it's highlighting a passage about deceit that he had highlighted in like the last book he had read, and then we find out how he was hit by a truck. It turns out he was like restoring an old farm. He's walking across the street and gets hit by a truck. And then she explains she doesn't believe it was an accident. And so, then, let's see here. I totally missed what I wrote here. So basically we also, okay, that's it. Okay. So obelisks, like, so her father is buried and they make like an obelisk as like his headstone. And then it turns out that he actually collected obelisks. And it starts getting into a little bit of like this city that he lives in. And, basically she draws like this map showing the narrow compass of like how little he moved out, like outside of the area that he grew up, like within his lifetime. And so it shows his birth. So here's where her dad's grave was. Here's where the house where he and and her mom raised them was, here's the farm where he was born, right? And then here is where he was killed. So it's like all within this circle. And then she kind of goes on to sort of expand on how small this town is, and show just like all of his relatives also live like within, a street of each other. And so, yeah, so the family stayed in the same town. And then that the mother had wanted them to move is kind of another thing we find. So. All right. So then it gets into heavily like how her parents met, and that her mom met her dad when he was in the army, and that they were sort of like living in Europe, being like these sort of almost like beat artists while he was stationed in, I think, Germany, and that suddenly he found out that his father had died, was given notice, and was told to go back to his hometown to take care of the family business. And then we find out that the family business is running a funeral parlor. And so this goes down to the great grandfather in like the old school Hirsch. And so now you'll start understanding why it's called fun home, right? Funeral home. So the father moves back to the town, starts teaching English, takes a job teaching English. And because funeral directing apparently isn't enough to kind of make a full income, so he teaches English full time, and then he's a part-time funeral director, funeral home director, and mortician. And so Bechdel starts thinking that they live in the Addams family, and this is her as a kid looking at pictures of the Addams family before she could read, and just feeling like, hey, that looks like me. And then an old picture of her as a child where she's like wearing a black velvet dress my father wrestled me into. I appear to be in mourning. She's just sort of, her mom even jokes that she's a vampire. So Bechdel starts thinking they're the Addams family, and that her mother is like Morticia. And then she just gets into some of the things like kids do growing up in a funeral home, where they're like looking at an empty grave and they're like, can I get in? So, okay. So the kids grow up playing in a funeral home, and the one rule is that they aren't allowed to climb in the caskets. But they do all these games with the different funeral items, like the chairs and basically the suction cup flags that you stick on cars for processions. They're just goofing around playing with them. And we also find out that the grandmother lives in the funeral home. And so and there's like I guess like they lower caskets from like the second floor, but that they would actually stay the night because their grandmother lives upstairs. And so they would stay the night at the funeral home. It wasn't rare for them to do. And then we get into a little bit more. So this is just some stuff. The grandma, when they're staying the night, and this is a really important story, tells a story that they loved hearing as kids about their father. And how he wandered out in the middle of a farmyard and got lost. And that basically the mailman, and I love this because this is like one of Bechdel's strengths, is she kind of says like, but I liked to think of him as a milkman. So then when she tells the story, she just makes him a milkman, even though he's a mailman. But that her father wandered out and got stuck in the mud, and then was unable to escape until this man found him. And everything, every thread woven in this book gets kind of tied in the end too. So now we get into like while cleaning. So they have to clean the embalming room, and she's sort of cleaning it, and one day her father calls her back there. Sorry, there was something I didn't block out. And just exposes her to a dead body. And it's like, so she gets this exposure to a dead body, and he has like this kind of cold reaction, and she wonders if that's how he was exposed to it as a kid, was just like her saying, I mean, like, did his father just kind of call him in and say like, hey, could you hand me, like, he just asks her to like hand him some scissors.
Yeah.
And then she closes the door and is just kind of haunted by that. So then that's the first dead body, and she since that point kind of learns how to just suppress emotion. And so you'll see that happening with her character too, as well as with her family, where it's like they don't really express emotion because they're used to just kind of like confronting dead bodies and stuff every day, which I think would take a toll on you.
And living in an oppressive and abusive home. That's kind of a survival tactic as well.
100%. Yeah. So Alison gets a library job at her college. We find that out. And when she finds out that her father has died, she has 2 minutes of crying, and then that's about it. So she bikes home. And then when she gets there, her and her brother are just strangely smiling. And she notices that they just have like this shared thing in their family where they don't really express emotion, probably because of abuse and then constantly dealing with death. So then she starts comparing her father to Camus and to Camus' biography. And she actually suspects, even based on like some Camus quotes that she had read, and then also just the fact that like he smoked and Camus smoked, and so she's looking at like old photos of them and sort of comparing and contrasting. But she also just suspects that her father, being a mortician, probably wasn't going to be compelled by, because Camus had an argument about sort of existentialism and how like sort of suicide was like the ultimate act of existentialism. But then he kind of ties a bow around it and talks about how suicide's actually idiotic. And that's sort of the arc of Camus. But she was saying, like, suspecting that her father was a mortician, being constantly confronted by death, that might have overridden Camus' argument. And so she gets into that. Let's see, since they grew up dealing with death, it basically, you know, she thought like initially like, well, when she dealt with like a family death, it would make the death easier, but she said it actually makes it stranger, because it's like you get so used to seeing other people that like experiencing it close to home is a shock. And then also she starts to feel consolidation, like throughout this, she's the whole funeral scene, she's feeling numb. And the only thing that makes her feel consolation is when the funeral director that they're dealing with like tries to give her a consoling hand, and she gets to like shove his hand off. And then we start finding that she, through violence, starts feeling some consolidation. Like that's the only thing giving her feelings of some kind of consolidation over, you know, this horrible thing. And then she ties it back to being stuck in the mud, but that her father was stuck in the mud for a good this time.
Mm.
So anyhow, got to move a little faster. So chapter 3, that's a very heavy book, you know, but very brilliantly.
You know, we don't have to make it through the entire...
Yeah, that's my thought too, is like, I'm kind of thinking I'll probably go through like maybe one more chapter and then just kind of flip through and highlight some stuff.
Yeah. Real quick, Gary was saying in college, he interned at a medical examiner's office and was basically offered a job as an autopsy assistant. He said he didn't want to do it. And she was telling him that he'd get used to it. And he said, I'm sure I would, but that's not something I want to get used to.
Yeah, it is very strange. I mean, I even remember in anatomy classes, all the biology students who were working there all the time and the med students, they were at the point where they'd like joke around with the dead bodies because they were just so comfortable with it. And I remember thinking, I don't want to get there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so she starts talking about she's coming to grips with her father's death. She's drinking. We find out that that 4 months before, 4 months before her father's death, that she had actually sent a letter to her mom and dad saying that she was a lesbian. So her mother, after she had mentioned that she was a lesbian, her mother at first is very opposed to it. Her father's less reluctant about it. And then after a lot of back and forth and really hard conversations, her mother kind of reveals that her father's been having affairs with other men throughout their whole marriage. And that as a young boy, her father had been molested by a farmhand. And so this is this huge moment for her, coming out, sharing her identity. And she feels like it's been stolen by her father. And also just doesn't really know how to process the fact that this whole facet of her father that she didn't know, is coming out now. So,
and also stereotypically tied to the untrue myth that people are homosexual because of some sort of past tragedy.
Yeah.
Because that's something that I would hear a lot in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of interesting that she had that experience with her dad and her mom.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, it's very, very interesting. So her mother reveals that So then she feels upstaged and starts feeling like her letter might have been why he committed suicide. And so we also find out that Bruce had this crazy old library where he would loan books to community members, and he had these crazy old books. And she starts figuring out that some of these community members that he was loaning books to, it might have been a sexual advance kind of thing. And let's see where we're at for time. So, okay. So we also find out that in the Army, Bruce was really obsessed with F. Scott Fitzgerald and was obsessed with this biography of Fitzgerald called The Far Side of Paradise, and is writing letters to her mom and stuff about it. And then she starts drawing literary comparisons between her father and Gatsby, because her father, while he didn't become wealthy, he kind of grew from being this sort of farmhand to being this person with an estate and respect in the town, and this whole Victorian manner. And then she starts comparing and contrasting her father with that, and then at the same time her mom to Helen in Henry James novels. And so it talks about how her parents never really talked about how they met. And let me see if I can find that actually. So here's her comparisons where it's just showing these interesting, Catherine as the lover and Morris the beloved. She does tons of literary allusion and comparison throughout the work. Oh, here it is. So she says, "How did you meet Dad?" And then the phone rings. And she goes, "I don't remember. Keep mixing. I need to concentrate on what I'm doing." And so you just get this really cold relationship with them. We also find out that there were 2 moments that she remembers her parents being affectionate in front of her, and that they're constantly arguing, and that the parents met during so finally at one point in her life, she's able to kind of weasel out of her parents that they met in Taming of the Shrew in college. And she debates whether he fell in love with the character that he himself was playing, or whether he fell in love with the character she was playing, or whether they actually fell in love. And then it just kind of juxtaposes their first meeting with just this crazy violence and language that, yelling and spousal issues So yeah, so she starts comparing the parents to Henry James' Portrait of a Lady, and talk about them going to Germany, to Paris when he was still stationed in Germany, after they got married in Germany, and then that Helen finds out that they're visiting a friend that he was lovers with, so she's about to bail, and he kind of gets her to come back, and she just kind of ends up stuck with him for a long time. She's remembering a trip to Europe, and then also convinces her parents to buy her boots and let her sort of like wear swim trunks instead of swimsuit, and these things like stand out to her, I think, because it's like her kind of expressing her own gender identity at an early age, and that she basically becomes resolved after seeing her parents' like terrible relationships that she's not going to ever get married but live like an artistic life. So then in college, she starts reading more about, kind of being a lesbian and what, like, the history of that. And from that starts dipping into these deep dives of different books about gender identity. And let's see here. Oh, are you still there? Did it cut?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So she's having this growing desire to act on her gender identity, but she hasn't yet. We find that out. And that her father is accepting that her mom stops talking to her, but she sends her the heart-shattering letter, hoping she isn't, but accepting if she is, which we see right here. And then we see where she meets the figure of Joan in her gender studies class. And then we're kind of moving forward. So Joan is like her girlfriend, so she finally sort of acts on it. So all these sequences next are blocked out, but they're about like her sexual awakening and political awakening. And she finds it equally also as a good distraction from dealing with her parents, because this is before her father's passed away, but just dealing with thinking about all the different possibilities. We find out the dad is getting violent, and so the mom actually asks for a divorce. And then 2 weeks later, she's basically told, oh my goodness. Okay. So there's also some memories of like her asking her father to buy a Mad Magazine book. Sorry. So let's see here. Okay, that's right. I'm sorry. So so her mom sells and gets rid of all the library books in her father's house. I'm sorry, I kind of zoomed forward to that. And that's what she's doing here, is just starting to give away the books. And then she goes back to comparing her father to Gatsby, and kind of compares it to the literary scene where Gatsby's in his library and they're stunned by like all the books that he has. And so she actually even suspects that her father timed his death with Fitzgerald and wants to pretend his death wasn't due to her letter. And so then we're on to chapter 4, and I'm going to just kind of I don't know. We still got a little bit of time. How are we doing on time?
You're fine.
Okay. So so in the shadow of young girls in flower. So this is the next section. And there, by the way, just the thing I love about the art style is it's something you'd barely notice. Like, and I don't mean that in a negative way. Like, it kind of sits in the background in a good way, where it's very simple. It's not overcomplicated. Everything in it is extremely clear. And her visual choices and what she shows, I think, are perfect for like the storytelling. And I actually think that's kind of a good lesson in like simplicity. But So we find out, let's see here. So we find out that her father died gardening while he was working in the house. And then it gets into her father's obsession with flowers. And then the truck driver, thought he saw a snake, and she was saying perhaps he did see a snake who hit him. So then it starts getting into her father's like crazy obsession with flowers. And she just starts noticing all these things about her father that were like very effeminate and that she hadn't really noticed like as heavily, as a kid. Mm-hmm. But so, it talks about he's also like a neat freak and kind of obsessive, and like if they're playing baseball as kids and the baseball fell into the garden, he would basically get lost weeding instead of getting the ball. And then it starts getting into, we find out that, so all of this is like different gardening themes, very beautifully written, but lots of gardening themes. And then we also find out that some of the boys that he was having an affair with were the babysitters of them as kids, and so this is the first one, Roy, and we also find out that a young Alison is really obsessed with masculinity, and she felt like the lack of masculinity in her household, like she felt a desire to be the masculinity in the household, and so. So she's talking about that. Let's see. She also sees a contrast with her own father, where it's like she's sort of becoming very interested in all these masculine traits. Her father is obsessed with like flowers and feminine traits. So anyhow, she steps into it, and she gets nicknamed Butch by her friends as a kid. And she also just starts realizing that her gender expression is at odds with her sex, and that her father, part of why he's so controlling of like how she dresses is that he's almost like trying to live through her, like have her be this ultra feminine figure. Mm-hmm. I also want to say, like, it's interesting reviewing a book like this as like a cisgendered male. It's like I'm not. But I think one of the beautiful things about this book is I think it's written in a way that's accessible to anyone who likes literature, and it's very empathetic and relatable, I think, and she does an excellent job of just sort of bridging the divide and just writing a really great story. But there's definitely issues in this that I can only, mildly relate to. So she also finds photos of her family gardener, Roy, who's sort of in this like very sexual pose that her father had stashed in his family photos. And she also remembers them taking Roy on vacation. But it's on the same roll of film as like her and her brothers playing as children. And let's see here. So they're on this, she remembers on this vacation walking through San Francisco. Her parents are showing her all the different areas they met. This, by the way, is such a good description of San Francisco, where they're walking through it and she points to all the different terrible smells within the street. And it's just kind of funny because she was talking about the stunning richness and complexity of the city. But that's very interesting to me. So she also mentioned some of the activism that happened in San Francisco and that it happened around that same time, and then even jokes that she might just be writing that in because she wants to have had that be a part of her story. And let's see. So it continues and talks about how they met in college, how her parents met in college. And then I think we've still got a little bit of time. How are we doing?
Well, it depends on how much you want to talk after.
Yeah, so I think what I'll do is just kind of zoom through it. So it basically gets into some just really excellent things, and I don't want to give away too much either because it's a book people should buy. But it
Yeah.
starts talking about, and she has this way of flowing the narration. Like in this sequence, her parents are showing her a bar that they met at. It flashes forward to when she's older and she's out as a lesbian trying to get into the bar, and they actually get 86'd for it. It talks about different areas of discrimination that she's dealt with as an adult who's a homosexual. Um, and then she starts sort of bringing forward all these stories about her father, some that are really disturbing because the man was sleeping with underage, men, which is, disturbing to say the least. Like the just non-consenting adults sometimes, that's pretty bad. But it also just goes through all these different memories that she has as a child, and just sort of wrestling with her own identity. As it goes further in the book, we also start finding out some of the toll that her father's abuse and her parents' constant squabbling and arguing and really honestly both their abuse to their children. It's like it starts getting into that. And we actually start seeing it weigh on her as a kid. Also, his controlling nature, where she draws like a picture of a sunset, and her father insists on kind of redrawing the entire thing. And then the brilliance of her parents as artists, but how they're kind of like these autistic characters that are sort of obsessed with themselves and not really paying attention to their children.
Yeah.
And because of this lack of it, and this is a great panel sequence, it talks about all of them kind of isolating, where, they're otherwise absorbed in their own separate pursuits, but eating together. And that because of this, she starts developing OCD. And this goes into different OCD habits that she has as a kid, like counting things, obsessively, like putting the same stuffed animals to bed, like having mysterious incantations she has to say. And then she finds out that she thinks she might have actually picked it up from a book that her mom was reading about psychology that talks about compulsion. Because a lot of the behaviors, like she might have been mimicking those. But anyhow, we also find out that she starts journaling obsessively, and then when she's journaling, starts getting convicted about truth. In like when she writes something, she starts going, "Well, how do I know that?" So she'd say, "I think," between like every sentence, and then these different symbol systems that she started creating, drawing these sort of chaotic journal entries. But it also ties into like how she became an autobiographical cartoonist, right? Because she's obsessed with like journaling and documenting. She does these beautiful comparisons. I'm zooming through it right now, but it's like she does these beautiful comparisons of like, I really loved this, but when she's a kid, she didn't really notice that the Wind in the Willows coloring book that she had was the map, and that the map, like as a kid, like looked so much like Beach Creek where she grew up. Mm-hmm. And so she kind of parallels that. And there's constant parallels. So then she gets older. She decides to start forcing herself. Her mom starts being more involved with her. She also starts to force herself to start writing actual, like to start ridding herself of her own OCD. It gets into just some interesting stories about locusts and a plague of locusts. And then the great thing is, like, she sees the metaphor and things that actually happened in her life. So we also find out that her father gets arrested. Well, he gets cited, or a citation, for selling beer to minors. Or giving beer to minors, and then it turns out there's probably more complexity to what he got caught doing beyond just giving beer to minors. We find out her mom is finishing her master's degree, and we follow all these different wonderful arcs. But this whole chapter ends with a wild storm where all the trees around the house are knocked down, but just by luck, their house isn't destroyed. And she even points out the metaphor of like, but that like the next storm to hit like wouldn't leave the house standing. So then she starts studying feminist theory. It just goes through all sorts of memories as a kid of her finding her gender identity. We get to college when she is basically studying feminist theory and working on her degree, and she's bonding with her father because her father is an English teacher, and so he starts giving her all these different books. And she ends up having a class where there's a little bit of graphic scenes where she finds like a girlfriend. But we also find out that anyhow, she starts bonding with her father more because her father is a literary geek, and like, and so, but one of the books that she's studying in college that kind of sends her into the gender identity path turns out in this beautiful situation or sequence was provided by her father, and so that her father actually kind of knew, and that he was sort of trying to give her a hint in her life. And then it just kind of goes from there, and I don't want to kind of ruin the ending, but I will say overall it's just like a very poignant book. I don't know. Let's see, like my takeaways, I guess. Well, I guess before we get into meaning, I'll just say overall, like, what are your impressions so far on it?
Well, I mean, yeah, one of the biggest things that is interesting to me about this is it's so different from my experience that I think it would just be valuable in like its authenticity, and it's one of the things that I love about literature in general is being able to see things through somebody else's eyes, and feel through their experiences. That's the kind of the first thing that stands out. The next thing is not having read this book, but having had it just described to me really quickly. It's incredible the craft and the thought that has gone into kind of the chiasmus or the parallels. The symbolism of jumping back and forth and having still some ties together. I mean, I can definitely see how you are inspired by this, given you're doing a very similar thing in two stories, jumping back and forth. But yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, as a white heterosexual cisgendered man, I have had very different experiences and very different feelings. But I would like to know and understand and empathize with people who feel and think and see the world and experience the world differently than I do. And so books like this, I think, are very intriguing.
Yeah, and I think the thing that is definitely striking about it is like the adherence to truth and like the real authenticity to it. It doesn't feel like a heavy-handed or preachy book. It's just a book about somebody's life and their experience. And to me, that's memoir at its best. So before I kind of get into like too much of what we took away and stuff like that, should we do our audit?
Yes, it's time to balance the books.
All right.
So if you would like to support the show, if you have any interest in doing those things, there are two main ways that you can do that. The first is you can go to, let me pull that up. You can go to audibletrial.com/IRS for a free audiobook that you get to keep. And the Indie Review Show is brought to you by Audible, and you can get a free audiobook and support the show by going to that website, audibletrial.com/IRS. And this week I'm recommending, since we're doing kind of we've done some lighthearted shows and we've done some heavier shows. This week I'm recommending a heavier book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, subtitled The Fight for Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. Shoshana Zuboff was one of the first women to get tenure at Harvard Business School. She's an incredible researcher, and she has and researched and kind of compiled the history of tech companies, and you can see how she has gone from. You can see how tech companies have gone from, like watching what people are doing, to predicting what they're doing, to trying to control what they're doing. And it's a very interesting look that I think is a very important thing to talk about during a lot of the things that are going on in today's thing, where you've got AIs that are being created, and there's kind of an AI creation war between America and China, and you have kind of unregulated tech companies that are more powerful than a lot of governments, and this kind of peels back the layers of kind of camouflage. So anyway, if you're interested in that book or any other books, of which there are hundreds of thousands, they're just really good, go to audibletrial.com/IRS. And you can also check out irsagency.com, where we have the book that we're talking about now. And if you click on this link right there, then that'll take you to Amazon, where you can buy it, and it won't cost you any more, but they give us a little bit of a kickback. And also next week, we will be covering, I think I'm saying this right, Tardy's World War One. It was the War of the Trenches, and Gary Hodges is going to be presenting that for us. And so if you'd like to join us and follow along and have some thoughts with us, you can go to see what our schedule is there.
I love it.
Yeah.
Sweet. So yeah, for me, the meaning of this book, and I hope I gave a brief idea of it. I will say it's just like a really heartfelt book. Yeah. And I definitely I have a tendency when I'm going over just like a plot synopsis or a story synopsis of almost like reading it coldly, and yet I do want to really just definitely emphasize how emotionally raw the story is, and how invested in the characters you get. And I will say it's also a hard read, which is really but not a bad read. And what's great is she paints really complicated characters. Like her father, was abusive, slept with underage people, and had some issues, but at the same time, and in general would be really easy to paint as this black and white villain. But she brings nuance to that story of her relationship with her father, so that you feel the conflicting emotions that somebody would feel growing up with a father like that. And she does a really good job at that. So for me, the things that I loved about it is she writes richly using textual and visual literary analogies and comparisons, where she fluidly interweaves metaphor, and that really enriches her storytelling. She's daring and honest and blunt with her storytelling. There's not really a subject matter that she's shy about, and I love that in memoir. If you're gonna do memoir, I feel you should really go all in and do memoir. Mm-hmm. And then she has this simple illustrative style with watercolor second tones that I think suit and enrich the story, and they make me think about the use of simplicity in story, because like I mentioned when we were kind of thumbing through it, it's there's just something about that doesn't pull away from the narrative, And then it's just a candid slice of life from somebody who experienced trauma, and it just shows that can be really important and moving. And her paneling is simple and powerful, and it interweaves between different images of close-ups of text. I love that, the hand-lettered maps and books, and just sort of weaving that throughout the story, I think is great. And then I don't know, there was something about it that really reminded me of old Beverly Cleary kids books in the style that it was illustrated. and like, Mouse and the Motorcycle, like those old ones from when I grew up. And there's something about that I think really enhances the story as well. But I guess, like, for me, what I would steal and what I have stolen from it is the idea of literary writing, consistency, commitment to truth, weaving comparative weaving comparative metaphor into memoir, right? Where it's like using metaphor and comparison and analogies, I think, can really help people digest a heavy topic.
And one of the things I'm noticing that's very interesting to me is that, I mean, she calls it a tragicomic.
Yeah.
And that holds very true, where there did seem to be some lighthearted moments, very nuanced characters that were very gray, not black and white, good or bad. There was lighthearted moments and heavy topics. It's interesting when you separate yourself from something by time, it tends to, in your memory, become very polarized. It's either very good or very bad. In the moment, you can be enjoying yourself and have some ups and downs, and then have some down days and some up days. But then years later, telling that story, you're either going to put it on a pedestal and glorify it, or demonize it, whatever it is. And so whenever I see somebody doing something nuanced that involves memory, I'm super fascinated with that, because our natural inclination is to be not intentionally to lie, but to be untrue to the actual experience by creating these heroes and villains, when in actuality, things are very gray.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of some of the darkest times in my marriage, and my wife and I discussed that when she was going through postpartum depression for years, and I had kind of lost my identity in trying to help and doing some things, and we were both handling it incorrectly and everything. And yet, as dark as those 4 years were, we still had fun, and we still laughed, and we still joked with each other, and we still enjoyed things. And, it wasn't like every minute of every day was awful. But in remembering that and in looking back, it's often hard to think of that, because it's like whatever the majority is seems to take over and eliminate the minority.
Yeah, totally. And I think, like, we were at one advantage because Bechdel was so obsessive as a child about journaling. Right. She has, like, this crazy ability to sort of pull out specific events based on, like, her own journals or police reports, like, or, different news articles and stuff at the time. So I think the nice thing too about this is how well researched it is in that sense. And actually it's kind of fun because she'll also juxtapose her own journal entries and show how she was being dishonest in her journal entry. And so and she even brings up, like I think all good autobiography should, the questionability of her own narration at certain points. So she definitely highlights the questionable reliability of the narrator in the sense of autobio. And I think it's just expertly done, and rereading through it, I just felt like, man, if like two stories can be about an eighth of as good as, like, if I can just be an eighth of as good as this book, I'll feel pretty content. But I also love the complexity and diversity of the characters. And once again, as a cisgendered male who has not experienced, I can relate to specific things that she talks about, but her life is a completely different life than what I've had to grow up like struggling with or thinking about. And yet at the same time, I found it so compelling and something I could empathize with. And I just thought that was so well done as well, because it is hard sometimes coming from an outsider's perspective to be able to sort of look in somebody else's eyes. And when a memoir is well written, that's the great thing you get to do, is travel into other minds. And I think that's just excellent. So
Yeah, and along those lines, I mean, humanity is humanity, right?
yeah,
Gay, straight, black, white, there are differences, and yet we're all people, and we all experience ups and downs and things that are difficult. And while the events might be different, our perception of those events and how they affect us is very human, and that's very relatable.
100%.
And so that's another interesting thing about reading about what some people might call the other. I've been going through a book called Writing the Other, which is talking about how you write about people that you don't have personal experience with, and be real and authentic and true to their experiences. It's interesting that those differences are important and should not be glossed over, but also they don't alienate, or they shouldn't alienate in the way of like saying like that thing is alien to me. They have a different orientation or different skin color or different background or speak a different language, and so they become othered. Instead of that, you can say, well, like there are a lot of people that I identify with that also have many differences, and so the differences are there and they exist, they're facts, but they don't alienate and shouldn't other people. It's an interesting thing to wrestle with, because I think naturally, there is a little bit of biological imperative to some tribalism that in our modern times we should, be aware of and be cognizant of, so that we can empathize with people that we might not understand, and you should seek to understand.
Yeah. And on that note, I would definitely just at the end of the day, I gotta say, like, the writing in this is so powerful, so nuanced. Just from the structure of writing, the way that it's laid out, the way that there's just this beautiful literary allusion all throughout. It really just ends up mimicking. So the book she studies in college is Ulysses, right? Like that's her big final sort of study in order to get her degree. And the whole book is structured like Ulysses. And then she's talking about Ulysses being structured like the Odyssey, and her studying that, but it's like so meta and so many layers of complexity to the writing, that it's like I really do recommend people read it and check it out and see why this cartoonist and I think Gene Yang are like the two cartoonists who've gotten the Genius Grant. Like there's a reason. So yeah, sweet.
Well, I don't know how to wrap that up.